Hello, I'm Karen Long, President and founder of Streamline Government Contracts. Streamline helps small to mid-sized government contractors who seek experienced, effective support with contract management that will reduce your risks, increase your profits, and enhance your reputation. We do this by negotiating TAs, subcontracts, preparing estimates of completion when necessary, and speaking to contracting officers in their own language. We are the proud organizer of Government Contractor Chats and appreciate you joining us today. Now we'll turn it over to Lindsay. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Hello, everyone. I am Lindsay Riegelsberger, Operations Manager and Marketing Specialist for Streamline Government Contracts. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest speakers now. Today, we are joined by Craig Marino, Chief Operating Officer with Squadron Defense Group and a two-time guest speaker for Government Contractor Chat. And we are also joined by Isaac Wilson, Manufacturing Operations Manager with Squadron Defense Group. Today, they are going to discuss sensitive compartmented information facilities, or SCIFs. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Craig Marino.
Thanks, Lindsay. It's a pleasure to be here. We appreciate you and Karen giving us the opportunity to speak with the group. As you mentioned, Squadron Defense Group is in the SCIF business. We also provide facility security officer consulting services, but we've been designing and building and manufacturing SCIFs for about 20 years now. And Isaac has worked on the design and construction of gypsum SCIFs, mobile SCIFs, modular SCIFs, and has great expertise in that area. So I'm thrilled to have him along. But the goal today is to spend a little time talking about all of the various considerations that need to be taken into account when one is contemplating the construction or the development of a SCIF. There's a lot of factors that go into it, and a lot of the considerations take place even before you begin construction. But the first question that one has to wrestle with is, do you even need a SCIF? And we get phone calls every week from people expressing their interest in getting a SCIF. Most of the time they'll say, we absolutely need a SCIF and we need a SCIF now. And most of the time they really don't. The key is to take a look at your contract security requirements. And the question that you need to ask is there a requirement for processing top secret level or higher information, or possessing and discussing sensitive compartmented information at your facility? If you don't have either of those requirements, you don't need a SCIF. And there are a variety of less expensive alternatives to meet non-SCIF secure space requirements. Generally, we advise against building SCIFs unless you've got a clear contractual requirement. And the reason for that is SCIF projects typically involve pre-approval from an accrediting official. Without that, you're building on spec, and you take on the risk that you won't get accreditation. That could leave you with a very expensive conference room. Now, that isn't to say that you can't build a SCIF in advance of a contractual need and get it accredited later. We've done that for some of our clients. But you need to go into that effort with a clear understanding that building a SCIF without a contractual need creates risk.
So there's two primary types of SCIFs. Assuming you do have a requirement for a SCIF, there are fixed facilities and T-SCIFs, or temporary SCIFs. The fixed facility is just that. It's a SCIF built to remain in place for the duration of its life. It must be built in accordance with the ICD 705 standards as a basic guide for construction. But the specific design and construction may vary so long as they follow best practices and end up with the required performance results. A tactical or temporary T-SCIF is built with the expectation that it will be operational for a limited period of time, which is generally 1 year per T-SCIF accreditation. They can be mobile or a fixed structure, but they're most commonly used for OCONUS environments, where it's extremely costly or takes a very long time to build OCONUS, or the infrastructure is not in place for a fixed facility. T-SCIFs are often built to be relocated, repositioned, and depending on their design, use and operating environment can be accredited for use with some or all of the ICD 705 elements. So mission requirements, operational life cycle, and the operational settings will all affect into how much or how little of the 705s must be followed. But ultimately, the accrediting official or the AO will determine that at the outset of the project. For example, a plywood building with nothing more than a deadbolt on the door can be accredited as a T-skiff in a forward operating location if the AO determines that that meets the sufficient security for the threats of that environment. It's the AO who will balance the operational need with the ability to rapidly comply with standards for accreditation. That the nature and duration of your program and the location of operation, as well as the potential for future skiff needs beyond the immediate requirement, will influence whether a fixed facility or a T-skiff is preferred. Those factors, along with your construction budget, will also guide your decisions with regards to a skiff construction option that you select. Now, there's three basic types of skiffs. There's gypsum skiffs, mobile skiffs, and modular skiffs. We'll start with the gypsum skiffs. They're conventionally stick-framed in place. Traditional construction involves layers of sheetrock or drywall, TBM foil, and other building materials that are built into place, making it permanent. It can involve construction with an unfinished or shell build office environment or a renovation of an existing office space. Construction generally must wait for receipt of the county building permits, and the construction site must have a full-time SSM or site security manager to control access and maintain oversight of all the construction materials. The mobile skiff, generally based on an ISO shipping container, which is enhanced to provide a turnkey plug-and-play skiff that can go anywhere throughout the world, depending on the design. Because permitting isn't typically required, the construction is performed off-site, and the build time and delivery tends to be much faster. The design configurations are basically unlimited. They can be relocated as needed, although this will involve reaccreditation each time it's moved. Mobile skiffs can be situated outside or within a warehouse or other enclosed environment of sufficient size to house them.
Modular skiffs are comprised of prefabricated panels, which are manufactured off-site and then assembled within an existing structure, essentially creating a room within a room. This limits the amount of on-site activity and enables faster and more discrete installation, as manufacturing can occur in parallel while building permits are being secured. Modular skiffs can be expanded or reconfigured, and they're readily relocated by disassembling and then reassembling the panels at the new location. This adds to their utility as well as their usable life. We actually had a client recently that no longer needed their modular skiff. They actually sold it to another company who asked us to come out, take it down, transport it to their offices, and then reassemble it for reaccreditation.
There's some location factors. Primarily, it's CONUS and no CONUS. When you're building a skiff in the U.S., the following requirements are at work. So you have to have a construction personnel, which must be U.S. citizens only, but they may not require a PCL. Skiffs may only be built by U.S.-owned companies and using a U.S.-owned general contractor and U.S.-owned subcontractors. A site security manager, SSM, must be on the construction site for the duration of the project from start to finish to control the records and access to the work site and inspect materials as they're delivered and the security of those materials. When you're building OCONUS, the skiff overseas requires in part a function of the specifics involved, right? So cleared escorts are required to build overseas, and the construction personnel must have a PCL. Conversely, those are not absolute requirements in CONUS.
Regardless of which type of skiff you're building or where it's physically located, a chief consideration and an absolute requirement is a multi-layer of security or security in depth. This can take the form of elaborate access control systems, intrusion detection systems, and camera networks. It can also involve less sophisticated elements, including barbed wire perimeters, fencing, and security guards. Skiffs are not meant to be impenetrable, but they are meant to provide sufficient protection and time for notification to a response team in the event of a security breach. As a result, your ability to establish security in depth will be a chief factor as you consider location. Where are you going to place this skiff? Generally speaking, skiffs built or installed in office settings, and we'll focus on that scenario for the purpose of this discussion in this audience, have several basic elements that you want to incorporate. While it's possible to establish a skiff on the first floor of the building, the strong preference is for skiffs to be positioned at least 18 feet above ground. Similarly, skiffs can be built along window lines, but doing so introduces another element that will have to be mitigated.
And the location of your skiff needs to allow for inspectable and controlled space on all sides of the skiff, including below the floor. We recently, in the past year, received an inquiry to elevate a skiff onto lucite clear Lexan blocks so they could allow for regular review under the skiff. So there's stories of OCONUS folks drilling through the skiff floor from the office below. So if you don't have that inspectable space, you need to be able to view in between your skiff and the actual structure floor. And you'll also want to be knowledgeable of all of your neighbors in the office. So do you share a wall or a common corridor with an unknown party? Who's above and below you? Are there other buildings nearby with line of sight into your office via the window line? Are there other skiffs within the building or the buildings immediately surrounding yours? Those will all factor into security and depth. Also, do you have staff or security service provider close enough to meet the response times which are required in the event of a security event? If appropriate, what is your proximity to armed response capabilities? What is the security for the building and for the office suite as well? You have to remember the security and depth plays into the overall perimeter as well as the actual skiff. Additional technical considerations specific to the building and the office are the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing already in place that may need to be altered or repositioned to accommodate the skiff. That can be quite costly to move systems out of the way of the skiff that don't support it. The distance from the proposed skiff location to those electrical, mechanical, and communication rooms and the rooms that they will have to tie into further away costs more. Whether or not there's capacity available within the main electrical panel, because you have to have a dedicated electrical feed to that skiff. And then we move on to different considerations for skiff use, and I'll let Craig take that one.
You know, the work being performed in the skiff is also going to impact its design and construction. Are you going to be housing workstations, or is it just going to be a conference room? Are you going to have secure video teleconferences, or will it operate as a data center? And then in addition to that, you've got to consider that certain agencies and their accreditors emphasize certain technical requirements more than others. This is why it's critical to always build the best practices and not cut corners, because your future activities may require more stringent mitigations than your current work calls for. And retroactively updating or upgrading a skiff to higher tempest or sound attenuation ratings is far more complicated and expensive than building to those higher standards initially. Ideally, what you'd like to do is future-proof your skiff as much as possible so that you can accommodate the requirements of any future projects. And I think it's worth pausing for a second and just understanding that there is a significant effort underway to allow for greater reciprocity across agencies for the use of skiffs originally built to support another agency. It's an ongoing effort, but the government's aware of the costs and the operational headaches that result when such reciprocity is not provided. You wind up in a situation where you're having to go to different skiff locations in order to do work for different agencies. It's fair to say, unfortunately, that at the moment, skiff reciprocity is fairly inconsistent across agencies.
We'll talk about the schedule for a construction project. So there's the milestones and timelines. As we discussed, there's a large number of project elements involved in the construction of a skiff, depending on what it is you're building it for and the size and complexity of the systems. And it's critical to lay them out in advance to ensure smooth integration between the parties involved and minimize the delays and change orders along the way to completion and then ultimately accreditation. So the first step is to generate design and bid documents for the skiff, right? So that involves selecting an architect, MEP engineers or mechanical, electrical, plumbing engineers, structural engineers, skiff subject matter experts, and together they will produce a fully reviewed and accredited permit set. So when you go out to permit, it is what is actually to be built, and you're not going to be hit with change orders. This is followed by the preparation and submission of pre-construction accreditation documents to the accrediting organization or AO. So the responsibility for the skiff's ultimate approval is by them. And there's a number of documents which you must create and submit for their review before you start construction. That is the construction security plan, or a CSP, and that documents the security parameters of the project, basically from day one through to completion and the occupancy. And it spells out all of the parameters in place to ensure security of materials and personnel and the facility when it's not, actively being built. The pre-construction checklist, which lays out the user data and building security in depth, personnel site security, physical site security, and then there's a pre-construction fixed facility checklist, or an FFC, which specifies what is being built and how. Right, all the different levels of mitigation that are part of that process to ensure that you are meeting the radio frequency, sound attenuation, and force protection requirements under IC 705. The plan security and depth of the secure area is documented within attachments. So as part of that FFC, there's a number of slides which must basically show scaled plans of where those mitigations are in the construction of the facility. On occasion, you'll also have to submit a pre-construction tempest addendum. So that provides the city location, surrounding area, building, and inspectable perimeter of the SCIF. Basically, the overall top view down, drilling into where the location is from the city inward. The mitigations of any of the vulnerabilities that penetrate the SCIF, from HVAC, plumbing, electrical, low volt. How are you filtering communication lines that go in if they're conductive, if they're copper penetrations is part of that. As well as all the building systems and how those penetrate, because those are all the weak points of your SCIF. The AO may have questions or concerns, and these need to be addressed before you start the project. So that's why you must submit those documents prior to starting construction in order to correct those documents before you start. You should anticipate this taking at least a month, typically many months, although the AO responses can vary wildly depending on level of priority and your point of contact there. While awaiting for AO approval, the bids should be solicited from contractors, right? And meetings held to select the team that will actually do the work. They'll need to review the space in person to evaluate the various construction considerations mentioned earlier. And more mundane factors such as the size and proximity of the service elevators, any building access and work restrictions, locations of loading docks, et cetera. Are you on a federal installation, which is going to create a lot of roadblocks to access and delay the construction every single day when personnel are accessing the work site? Or are you in a commercial environment with much quicker access to the work site? That will very much affect the cost of the actual construction for the same facility in one place versus another. Key questions that you should raise in part of the selection process of your contractors and engineers prior to the SCIF building experience of the organization and the project manager that will be assigned to your project. What sort of level of experience does he have specifically, or she, for that construction project? The size and composition of the team of the skilled tradesmen that will be building your SCIF. Are they direct general contractor employees, or are they subcontractors, or are they subcontractors of subcontractors? The level of technical knowledge tends to degrade as you add more subcontractors under other subcontractors, right? They get the cheapest guy that knows the least. So you want to address that part when you're selecting your contractors. The confirmation of access to the raw materials required to complete the project, which is really important these days with all the supply chain issues that we have, specifically related to anything that has electrical components involved. There's significant delays in electrical components. So you may want to start your project a year in advance to absorb the lead times for electrical components. And then the process which they plan to meet the security requirements involved in building the SCIF in compliance with IC 705. That's of paramount importance. Ultimately, you need to assess whether they have the skills and the wherewithal to complete your project on time, on budget, and with the certainty of accreditation success. Anticipate at least 2 to 4 weeks to select the different contractors. Depending on the scale and complexity of the SCIF design, any construction work being done to neighboring office areas, you should anticipate construction being 2 to 3 month effort minimum for a small space. Again, supply chain issues, can wreak havoc on the construction timelines as the raw materials have become scarce, and factor into the variables as best as you can when you're developing your timeline. Once construction is complete, post-accreditation AO documents are involving physical and certified tempest technical authority, or the CTTA approval, can range from a week to several months. The fact is these resources are limited and spread thin as they continue to dig out of the COVID backlog. Finally, when high side comms or networks are involved, installation accreditation can range anywhere from a week to a year, depending on the specifics. So it's not our intent to be vague on the timelines, but there's little you can do to control the pace at which the government moves.
Naturally, one of the key questions is, what's all of this going to cost? And your budget is a critical factor in evaluating your options and planning your project. In addition to the construction costs themselves, you need to remember that you're going to have to factor in security in depth, which will include the main door and access controls, alarm system, CCT coverage, exterior lighting, security staff, and the operating business hours of the building you select. It's important that you understand which of those resources might already be in place as part of the overall building infrastructure and what portions of that are available to you. You don't want to go out and be spending money on things that are already there that you can leverage. Security in depth will also involve access control for the entry door to the office suite and the internal door that leads to the SCIF, alarm and CCTV systems, as well as your visitor security controls at the reception area. Those will almost certainly be your responsibility. The distance from the SCIF location you select to the floor's electrical and mechanical rooms and the communications demarc points will also impact cost, as will whether or not there's adequate amperage capacity in the floor's electrical panels for a dedicated power feed to the SCIF. You'll want to understand whether or not the building's HVAC system operates 24/7 and whether it's sufficient for your SCIF usage needs, or whether you'll have to install a dedicated supplemental unit. You want to take a look at the building's existing conduit, pipes, and ductwork, which can create additional and, as Isaac mentioned, substantial costs if they need to be relocated in order to accommodate the SCIF. This is particularly true if there's limited space above the drop ceiling. And then you'll want to know whether or not there's adequate loading docks and service elevators so that you can determine just how freely your construction team can access the building and those resources. Are they limited to doing construction work outside of normal business hours so they don't disrupt other tenants? And then naturally, the cost of any of the interior finishes and the equipment that goes along with it will add to the overall cost. Do you need to have GSA safes? Do you need secure approved shredders? Do you need a video teleconferencing system, server racks, UPS units, KVM switches, classified phones, and other communication systems? All of those need to be baked into your budgeting process. Then once your SCIF is in place, operational and accredited, there are going to be ongoing operational costs to maintain the security posture of the facility itself. Things like intrusion detection and access control systems. There are annual fees that go along with the software updates that are required to maintain the security integrity of those systems. You need to have central monitoring and response services available in case there is actually some sort of security breach that takes place. Somebody's got to be monitoring all of the sensors that are established so that they can alert the response team to get there quickly. There's 24-hour system services, right? If some of your internal infrastructure starts to go offline, that can jeopardize whether or not those monitoring and sensors are actually operational. So you've got to be in a position to put people in motion to address that on a 24-hour basis. You'll need to have semi-annual inspections and 2050 certification that validates and verifies that all of your security systems are in fact operational. And you're going to want to have preventative maintenance on your utilities, HVAC, sprinkler, fire alarm, etc. Really, it is beyond inconvenient to suddenly have issues with some of the basic underlying utilities that we take for granted in a SCIF environment. It just gets expensive in a hurry if you've got to do maintenance on those in a crisis situation, and also taking into account the fact that you're doing very sensitive work in that space to begin with, and interrupting that work is also very costly. And then, the more mundane things like cleaning service. depending on the environment and depending on the size of the operation, it may not be reasonable to expect that the staff that's working within the skiff are able or likely to be cleaning up the environment that they're working in. And so you have to identify cleaning staff that have cleared personnel to come in and do the cleaning work on the space involved. And then finally, a facility security officer support to ensure that the skiff is being operated appropriately. There's a great deal that goes into monitoring who's entering, when they're entering, and ensuring that the skiff is being operated in an appropriate manner. As we noted at the beginning, there's a lot that you want to think through and plan for before you begin actual construction of your skiff. And hopefully we've given you a general understanding of what those topics are, but every skiff project is unique. So with all of that said, we'd like to open it up to any questions that you folks might have.
Great. Thank you, Craig and Isaac. Let's see. I have some questions for you all. I don't know if our audience members do. So I have a question about like, is the company accredited or are individuals certified or both to do skiffs?
So maybe accredited isn't the ideal term for it. So the construction of a skiff has to be done by a U.S. contractor only, and U.S. personnel. Part of the pre-construction accreditation process is a checklist which denotes all of the personnel that are working on the project. So you'll have to list who's the general contractor and is that general contractor a U.S. owned company, right? Is there any foreign influence in that company? All of the subcontractors that flow under that would also be listed as U.S. only. When it comes to clearances, that's a process based upon what is required from the accrediting organization for that construction, and most specifically, that is OCONUS construction projects where you have to have cleared construction workers.
Okay, really interesting. What I have a few more questions if you don't mind, and then I will also open it up to our audience to see if anybody else has questions. How much does it cost to build a skiff?
That's a great question. It depends on the size, the complexity, the location, and access to that location. There's so many factors. You could, if you build a very large skiff in a convenient location that's, let's say, local to folks that are very well versed in building skiffs, it can go as low as, say, $250 a square foot, or it could go as high as several $1,000s a square foot.
Wow.
So the range is massive, and it really depends on your location and all the variables that go into the construction. So if you're building a data center skiff, it's going to be much more expensive than sort of an operator skiff where you just have folks that are working in an environment without processing.
Okay. And when you say location, does that also mean like the what part of the country that you're building as well?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
So if you are in the DC metro area, it's going to be much more expensive than, say, in New Mexico, for instance, right? The construction labor is much more expensive in the DC metro area than it would be, say, in New Mexico, right? If you're in Albuquerque, right, you're going to have cheaper labor rates, but you may also not have you won't have the level of subject matter expertise involved in the construction process from a contractor in Albuquerque, New Mexico, as you would in the DC area, right? So there's a lot of variables that go into the cost. If you're on a federal installation, that is a much more expensive place to build than it is in a commercial environment, right? And the access to the locations, if you're building in a data center, it's much more expensive than building in a like Class A commercial space because it's essentially construction in a clean room. So there's just innumerable factors that go into the cost. That's why, if you're building, say, a 50,000 square foot skiff that's an open footprint, you might be able to get it down to 250 a square foot, maybe 300, if you're not also doing a data center inside of that. if it's just operational space and you just have to protect the perimeter of, say, a floor or two versus individual skiff rooms. It really varies. If you're building a 10 by 10, 100 square foot skiff and on a federal installation, you're probably a couple $1,000s a square foot.
Okay. And so
Yeah,
who,
Karen,
go
just
ahead,
to
I'm
tag-
sorry.
Just to tag on to that
Yeah.
response, we get phone calls all the time from folks saying, hey, we're interested in building a skiff. We think it's going to be 10 by 10. Can you tell us what it's going to cost? And really the only way to respond to that is to have a more in-depth discussion about what exactly it's going to be used for, and then to go through all of the questions and topics that Isaac has sort of walked us through today. It's impossible to just, folks want, can you give me a per square foot number? It varies. The bigger the skiff gets, the less the per square foot cost tends to be, because there are certain fundamental elements. You need a skiff door, you need wave guides, you need power filters, and to reduce those to a per square foot cost is really a function of, well, how big is the skiff? So it can be very misleading if someone just throws out a per square foot number without gathering all of the particulars of that specific environment and that specific requirement.
And most typically, some of the core questions that you'd want to ask somebody if they're looking to you get a inquiry for how much is it per square foot to build a 20 by 20 room. Well, you need to know, what are they doing in that room? Are they processing? Do they have amplified audio? Right, so that amplified audio versus non-amplified audio goes from STC 45 to STC 50. There's a cost difference there. So you need to know, if they're doing amplified audio, do they have VTC systems in there? What is the power requirement, which is why data centers are much more expensive, because the power requirement is much larger. So filtering power, providing that RF mitigation, can be expensive. If you just have an operator space, it's much cheaper because you have much smaller power requirements. And the security in depth, there's so many factors when it comes to, say, access control and alarm systems. The budget can be $5,000 to $100,000 for those systems alone, and that's at cost. So if you did, say, a DMP IDS system, which is the most standard, you'd be in the low range. But if you went to, say, a Vindicator system, you could approach six figures. So that's really, really difficult to give a square foot cost, because there's so many variables involved to get to that level. And a lot of those variables come from the AO. So not knowing who the AO is, it's very difficult to dial in what they may require. So if a accrediting organization for the space can be identified, you can make some assumptions if you had the subject matter expertise background, saying that, if it's an Air Force customer or a Space Force customer, they're likely to want a Vindicator system. So you could say that's going to be a much more expensive access control alarm system.
Well, that's really interesting. What about, so this is what I've heard people say before, is that a real estate broker is selling me, wants to sell them a vacant skiff, that they have one available. Is that something like that you can just use, or how would that work, or does that work?
Well, the first thing you need to do is have an assessment done of that space, right? So people can have skiffs accredited in the past and it not meet the current requirements. So the requirements change, or it could have passed accreditation on luck. They could have had a physical security and CTTA team that didn't do due diligence to find the issues when it was built originally. Case in point, there's a very large skiff facility in Maryland that we did a consult on a few years back, and massive facility. Went in there to look at what it was, because it was failing the sound attenuation tests. The walls were built completely wrong. So the structure of the facility would never meet accreditation standards. However, they had passed accreditation, but then they went to have BTC, and people could hear outside. Well, it was accredited. Had you years down the road, hey, we have a skiff here, it's up for lease, and then you go to get that accredited through your AO, you're inheriting that bad construction. So you really have to do an assessment of what's there. You have to assess the how it's built, The force protection in the walls, is there 9-gauge expanded metal or 5/8 plywood glued and screwed? If you're not, let's say if it's accredited for secret closed storage, well, it's going to be a different type of facility, and they may misclassify it. Hey, I have a skiff. Well, really, they don't. They have a secret closed area or a TS closed area. So that's something that Craig and I find quite often, where people misclassify a type of facility. So you really got to be careful what it is that they're actually telling you is in fact, what you're looking for. And so the only way you can do that is to do a physical assessment of the facility that you're looking at.
We have relationships with real estate brokers all over the area, and they call us infrequently, right? Someone will have moved out and they're trying to assess, hey, can I release this as a functional skiff? And we'll go on and we'll typically want to know, when was it built, who built it, and then really important is, can you give us the drawings and the wall details, because that really gets into the actual assembly or the components that were put into the build, and that informs us as to whether or not this still meets the current standards or whether it was built to an earlier standard that will no longer be acceptable, and therefore renovation work is going to need to be done.
So does a company like yours do assessments, or who does the assessments?
No, we get called in by real estate companies all the time to walk space and to pop ceiling tiles and to take a look at what's there and to review the plans to the extent that they're available, to help them determine whether or not it's viable as it currently stands, or whether or not it needs to undergo a renovation to become compliant with the current standards.
So, any other questions from our audience? Going once, going twice. All right. Well, thank you guys very much. Really appreciate it. And I'm going to turn it back to Lindsay now.
Thank you, Karen. Our government contractor chat webinar series takes place every third Wednesday each month from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Wednesday, May 17th, we have Bill Bolton presenting cyber liability, how it impacts your business. Wednesday, June 21st, we have Toby Musser presenting cybersecurity maturity model certification, what it is and why it matters. You can scan the QR code on the screen now to register for these webinars. If you haven't already done so, you can also visit us on our meetup group page, Government Contractor Chat, and visit our events page or calendar to register for these events. We wanted to thank you for being with us today. We hope to see you next time. Take care.